Let's now link up with Darius Okolla, who is an economist, a writer on the Kenyan economy and the global, and of course, he is joining us live from Nairobi, I presume. Good morning, Darius.
Good morning to you, Mr. Ayub. How are you doing?
Morning to you. We are faring well here. How is working from home? Yes, Darius, are you getting me?
Yeah, I can get you clearly.
All right. Basically, I was asking how is working from home?
It's pretty much a radical shift in terms of how we get work done in the country, and even at a personal level. A lot of what I do is, it's work I can do from online portals and platforms. So it isn't much of an adjustment. I think the big adjustment is the curfew and the restrictions more than it is really working from home. So it isn't an entirely new dynamic for me, but I think it still requires a bit of adjustment.
All right. Now, in regard to the economy and the SOFA approach adopted by the government, what Kenya needs is extra money in liquidity to lubricate the Kenyan economy. And that very much depends on how quickly we can fix our economy. Is so far the coordinated response by the government, can that stave off major Kenyan economic crisis?
To the best of my understanding, there are a number of policies they're thinking about in the background, and it's things they're weighing to do. You know, the law and some statutes allow them to print up to 5% of the previous year's tax. So they can raise this money. They can be able to, raise in excess of 120, 130 billion shillings. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger challenge for the government is not how to raise money. The challenge is a distribution model that ensures you're able to bring as much liquidity on the ground as possible. And also, of course, bringing up the conversation about special drawing rights on international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So that those two should provide enough liquidity. The challenge they are facing right now, and I don't think it's something they've had a proper solution to it, is the distribution model for this money that's been raised to show up liquidity in the markets.
Okay. Is it then what we, in regards to the current situation, is it an absolute must then that if it takes longer than anticipated, I'm talking about the crisis, of course, precipitated by the coronavirus pandemic, that budgets will go up automatically and there's going to be a deficit in terms of us, in some particular way, slowing to pay back our debt? And how will we balance all these books, even as we, of course, run against time to save lives in the country?
One of them is the fact that already our forexes are facing so much pressure. We will need to figure out how we are raising, money to pay for, to balance out our foreign exchanges. So that is a big issue. Of course, the cargo is still coming into the country, but the global supply chains have slowed down significantly. So that's also a challenge in terms of goods and supplies locally. So, there is it's a big challenge for the government to do that. And I think in the short run, we'll need to, we've seen a lot of positive development in terms of local manufacturing, Machakos, Makueni, Laikipia coming up, So that should, be one of our bigger mitigation models whereby we begin to bring back local manufacturing, which means, of course, we also need to fix the energy issue. The energy industry in this country is very inefficient. And yet almost 2/3, about 65% of local energy costs are consumed by industries. And yet we pay 6 times as much costlier cost of energy rather than countries like, say, China, almost 3 times what Egypt pays and almost 4 times what Tanzanians and South Africans pay. So once we fix the energy issue, then our manufacturing comes back. We look into how a better distribution model for the money raised by the government to show up liquidity in the local markets. And then we also look at how we can, as best and as soon as possible, fix agricultural supply chains, because at the bare minimum, people have to eat and get this food affordably and at the best variety possible for the longest time possible as we sort ourselves, or at least we figure out a solution out of this mess.
Okay, and in terms of the COVID-19, in regards to the Kenyan chapter, as is the case with the international, front, the two most critical aspects that have been affected are the hotel industry and the airline industry. You can't imagine Heathrow now receiving a downturn in terms of what it used to, in terms of the flights that were landing in the English capital, London, or in Beijing, or in Dubai, in the Gulf, or say in Joburg in South Africa. How does the government then uplift, and what is the status in regards to what the government is planning to inject to lubricate these important sectors, and tourism not forgetting, which is a backbone in our Kenyan economy?
I think at the current moment, considering it is a big industry. I mean, it's one of our big revenue earners, so of course we have to think about that. But it comes with a unique and a very special challenge, which is that we've made it so dependent on the foreign, tourism rather than local tourism. And so there's a conversation to be had in terms of if we are pumping liquidity into a lot of labor-intensive industries in the country to enable them get the liquidity and get people back to work. Basically, one of the things we also have to do is consider tourism in there, which means we'll have to make do with the fact that we'll take a dent in terms of foreign, incomes from tourism. But we can encourage this. I mean, we've done it before in terms of encouraging local tourism in the country and encouraging Kenyans to visit the conservation spaces and the leisure spaces as part of, enabling, money velocity in the economy. So it's one of those unique industries that, answers a lot, is a critical cog of the economy, but we'll have to rethink how it works going forward, especially in the medium to, short to medium term, where a lot of people, international are not traveling, even if we decided to market to them. And we've made that marketing to them as a critical aspect of survival of that industry without seeing these, vulnerability brought about by this kind of a pandemic.
All right.
Especially on global.
All right. It certainly is clear because we have not been saving for a rainy day in the country in terms of our economy, because as we speak at the moment, we have a budget shortfall of about 1 trillion Kenya shillings. That was by February, according to the projections given by the National Treasury. But it's equally important that we spend now, and that vis-a-vis or simultaneously in regard to the extraordinary levels of debt that Kenya needs to pay. How do we balance these books then, even in the midst of this calamity?
We need to start thinking about, number one, how to effect capital controls. We can't have NSC shedding 200, 300, 400 billions, consistently, over such short periods of time. So we need to start thinking about capital controls, which number one will help us protect our foreign exchange reserves. Number two, we have to start having conversations about debt rollovers, possible debt cancellations, and those two should enable us at least to buy some wiggle room in the short run to be able to figure out our debt structures locally, so that, again, we can start growing our businesses long enough to expand the taxation pool to provide the kind of revenue needed to pay for these, especially the foreign, dominated debts. We have to find debt rollovers and, debt amnesties and, some reengineering of these financial debt packages in a way that gives us wiggle room, because we cannot be able to pay for them at this point. It's just not possible under current circumstances.
All right. Now, taking stock of what has happened, of course, post-World War II in 1945, in the European context, it led to a new social contract that led to the formation of course, social welfare states in the EU. In our Kenyan context, post-COVID-19, when the dust settles and we shake off all the, of course, COVID-19 problems, what do you think then that we can inject in our economy in terms of Kenyans having affordable healthcare, which is accessible to all Kenyans, and perhaps can that also be the door with which we can realize the full implementation of the universal healthcare coverage in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big mistakes that the European Union and the wider Euro-America made in the 1970s, they seem to forget it within 20, 30 years. They let go of the welfare structures by allowing the financialization of basic stuff like education, healthcare, water, housing. In such a way, these are supposed to be facets of a society that are largely shored up by welfare structures, but also you want to keep private capital out of it, and that's not something they seriously thought about. I mean, Thatcher and Reagan came in and messed them up. And of course, we had this issue also here where education and the healthcare sector and water are largely, getting into private hands. So one of the things we need to fix in the short run is to get private capital out of these sectors of society. Make sure we double or triple government investments in healthcare, the blood banks, medical research, hospital institutions, ward bed capacities, also in the education sector, ensure that the public, primary, secondary, university, and the curriculums all work, in a way that are affordable to as many people as possible in the society. So that should be the first step. Number two is also looking at a way of democratizing capital. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to avoid this neoliberal marketization, and pushing capital into pretty much every sector of society, and ensuring that these modes or factors of production are accessible to as many people as possible. And one or two or three ways of doing that is bringing back cooperative societies, bringing back building societies, bringing back credit unions. These vehicles, these investment and monetary vehicles that are owned by hundreds, if not thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, such that you have as many people having access to factors of production within their meager income. So that is the two critical ways you can go about it. Keep them out of the basic sectors of society, the private capital that is. And number two, ensure as many people have access to capital as possible through these kinds of vehicles like cooperative societies, chamas and, what have you.
All right. Away from the Kenyan context, let's now take a look at the hit taken by the financial markets in the European Union and in the United States of America. Of course, what's happening in New York has led to a slump in terms of the performance of the New York Stock Exchange. And the EU appears to be fragmented in terms of who will offer the leadership needed on the European front. There is, of course, an absence in terms of the coordinated response from Angela Merkel in Germany, Emmanuel Macron in France, the UK Prime Minister just recovered from COVID-19, and the Italian Prime Minister, of course, Giuseppe Conte, is in the midst of the struggle of the coronavirus pandemic, not talking about Pedro Sanchez in Spain or equally Viktor Orban in Hungary. But what will glue the European Union post-COVID-19, now that we also have a White House under Donald Trump, which appears to be failing to offer lessons, as was the case, which were vital under Obama in the 2009 financial crisis?
I think one of the, the best sold myths within geopolitical maneuverings is the idea of a single factor Europe as a continent. I mean, it has as much diversity as we can see in the African continent. And in a sense, there have been divisions, beginning with the Eurozone crisis, 5-10 years ago. And they have been there, but in many ways, they've managed to keep, this, idea of a single European bloc. And in many ways, they've reflected certain administrative trade and policies that, create a semblance of unity. But by and large, this could be the one factor that, fractures the EU, irredeemably, if you will. We've seen the rise in nationalisms, not just in Trump world, but in the UK with Brexit. We've seen this in Germany. We've seen this across a lot of countries in Europe and, across the world. So this could be that, one major global, issue that essentially creates the kind of fractures that will be harder to bridge long after this pandemic is over. So the responses by the different countries and heads of states predictably was going to be different because of the different factors. Germany was still running trade surpluses. Spain and Italy were not there. This, Italian bond market has been in trouble for a while. Spain has had its challenges way before COVID. And in as much as these are strong and very complex economies, they've had their fair share of internal challenges, which they've not been able to surmount well. So this could just be that one moment where the EU part ways in a lot of, different sectors and corporations. All right.
Asante sana, Darius Okolla, who is an economist, in regard to giving us a perspective as to the response so far economically the government has lined up, and so far how that response is faring and how many Kenyans are looking up in regard to the government's response, and whether this will be the lifting point of the Kenyan economy in regard to the size and the speed of the policy response so far the government is rolling out to ensure that the Kenyan economy is immune, is wrapped up in immunity, and is cushioned from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. And good afternoon to you, Darius, and we appreciate your company here on the broadcast.